Welcome to our course on infinite scroll. This course is going to be covering building an infinite scroll project from scratch. We're going to be covering a number of different technologies. So on the front end, we're going to be looking at jQuery as our JavaScript library. We're also going to be incorporating a little bit of JavaScript, and then HTML is going to be really light. We're just going to build a structure for HTML, and we're going to use our jQuery AJAX methods in order to connect to our backend, and that backend is going to be a PHP backend where we're going to connect to the MySQL database, and we're going to deliver an API that the AJAX call is going to pick up. It's going to be a JSON formatted API, and AJAX is going to connect to that API and deliver that content from the database, outputting it back into our HTML page. So that is the project that we're working on, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to present this project to you today. My name is Lawrence. I've been building web applications since 1999, and one of the things I really enjoy about developing is building out projects. So starting out, creating a challenge for yourself, and coming up with a solution. That's what programming is all about, creating those solutions using technology for delivering content better and creating better user experiences online. So there are some prerequisites to this course. So a general understanding or a working knowledge of jQuery, JavaScript, and PHP is required. We're not going to be going in depth about these languages. We are going to be covering only the necessary parts of these languages in order to cover our project and create our project. We are going to be working on this project from scratch, and we're going to be incorporating all these technologies, and the objective of this course is really to demonstrate how all of these technologies can be incorporated into one web application and work together in a nice seamless fashion, and connecting them all together using the different languages. So we cover all aspects of these languages needed to create an API endpoint, and that is the goal of this course, to demonstrate how you can create an API endpoint, essentially getting database information and being able to pull it back into your front-end code. Then utilize that data that you're pulling back and do something with it, and in the course we're actually going to be outputting it into our HTML elements. So infinite scroll, if you're not familiar with that, it's a web design technique that loads content continuously, and as the user scrolls down the page, we're going to load even more content. So basically it eliminates the need for pagination, and it gives you the ability to present quite a bit of data, and usually it's ordered depending on the date when the data was populated, so you see the most recent entries first. You see it a lot of social media websites will use them, such as Twitter and Facebook, so it is a popular technique used on many websites, and this course will show you how to build one yourself. And what you're going to learn in this course is the techniques and how to build these types of applications from scratch. Essentially creating that API, coming up with the solution and executing that solution, and building out that capable application that can deliver what you're looking for, and that is that infinite scroll. So you're going to learn how to combine these technologies, and you're also going to learn how to use AJAX to send requests, return back that API data, and it's going to be in a JSON format, so that really makes it easy to pull it out and utilize it within your JavaScript. So you're going to learn how to set up the structure of your web application, find out about creating PHP databases and connect into PHP databases. So there is going to be quite a bit of PHP in this course, and it's going to be balanced off with jQuery and AJAX. So it's going to be roughly about half and half, might be a little bit more PHP heavy because the basis of this application is really that API. So that's where all the magic happens, and that's where we're connecting to the SQL database and outputting the JSON format. So it's PHP code. We're going to build customized JSON output, and we're also going to explore how we can make AJAX requests. We're also going to use JavaScript to detect the scroll, assemble that HTML page dynamically, and overall just examine how web applications are built. So the source code is included, and I'll give you a quick preview of what we're going to be building out. So essentially this is the infinite scroll application, and we've just got some dummy text here, and as you can see, as I scroll, we continuously load content, so we can continuously scroll down and load even more and more content until we get to the end. So we had 117 entries, but notice when I loaded the page, there was only about 7 coming out. And so all of this data is coming from a database. So all of this is contained within the database, and I'm going to actually show you how you can generate some dummy text as well into your database. So essentially all we're doing is we're pulling all of this content one by one, starting with the first item, you can see it there, and pulling it out and just outputting it within our HTML. So this is in order to simulate, obviously you'd have real content and real data rows that you wanted to output into your HTML in order to really use this application properly. So this was just to simulate that effect with some dummy content. So essentially we are calling over to the API. So this is the API endpoint, and this is the source code that's actually being returned. So we've got 10 entries being returned here, we've got 3 being returned here, we've got 1 being returned here. So notice that we can actually change the number of entries that we're pulling back. We could even pull back all 100, and this is all pulled back and formatted in a JSON format, which makes it really super easy to read via JavaScript. So the jQuery JavaScript can really loop through this content really easily and make use of it. So this is going to be a step-by-step project that we're going to be starting with a blank page and building out all of these files. So we're going to build out the index file, which is going to house the jQuery. We're also going to build out a database connection, so that's the PHP part of it, so making our connection to the database. We're also building out a way to insert some dummy text, and also then finally the API. So all of this is going to be included within this course. I've also included the source code so you can try it out for yourself, construct your own APIs, and utilize them within your own applications. So when you're ready, let's get started with building this infinite scroll project. Welcome. In this lesson, I'm going to be going over some of the resources that I'm going to be using within this course. So we are going to be using an editor. The editor that we're going to use is Brackets, and this is going to be so that we can write out our code. If you're interested in getting a version of Brackets, it's an Adobe product. It's free to download, open source, works across platforms. So go over to Brackets.io. So this is the editor that I have open over here. If you already have an editor that you're familiar and comfortable with using, then you can go ahead and stay with that. If you're looking to try out something new, then, or if you're looking to try out what I'm using within the course, then you can check out Brackets.io. The other resource that I'm using, because we do need to have a database, so the database essentially is going to house all of our content that we want to be able to connect with using our AJAX call. So we need to have an endpoint and we need to have some content. So we do need to have a backend database as well as some backend server code. So I'm going to be using XAMPP. So this is one of the quickest ways to get started with PHP and MySQL database. And essentially you can go over to apachefriends.org, select the platform that you're on, and download the correct version for your system, and it should be a fairly straightforward install where you just click next and you go through the default install. And what that will do is that will install XAMPP on your system, and then once you've installed it, you can run it, and basically you're going to have this pop-up window of the control panel, and the two options that you do need in order to run PHP is Apache, so it's already default installed on there, and then next there's MySQL, and this will give you your development environment, your PHP MySQL development environment. And it will also give you the ability to go over to localhost and see the content of the directory that's linked to your localhost. So I have it available in localhost/scroll. So that's the folder that I'm going to be working out of and creating my index page out of. So I'm able to go to localhost once I start up my XAMPP machine, and this just runs in the background and gives me that option. So the other thing that we need to install and look at, along with the XAMPP install, you're actually going to get phpMyAdmin. So some of you might already be familiar with this as a database a way to interact with your MySQL database, which a lot of hosts already employ this phpMyAdmin. So you go into your host, and if you want to see the content that's contained within your database, you simply select the right database, and you're able to interact with that content, write SQL queries, check statuses, find out more about what's available in the database, and so on. So we're able to see that there's an API, there's blog posts, we've got our SQL, so in here we're able to test and add SQL queries. We're also able to search our database. We've got a query area here, export, import, and so on. So we're not going to be doing a whole lot with MySQL. We're just going to be using it as a storage area in order to contain some of our content for our infinite scroll. So the idea for infinite scroll is that you go to a website and you can constantly keep scrolling down, so it doesn't initially load all the content, but what's going to happen is AJAX is going to make calls over to the source of our scroll content, and it's going to then render that out onto the page as the user scrolls down. And next, we're going to also make use of jQuery. So this is one of the easiest ways to set up AJAX calls. So we are going to be making use of it within this course as well. And basically that means that we need to access the jQuery library. So we're going to be bringing that into our project. And this is going to give us the ability to connect via AJAX to our database and pull back all of that scrolling information and then output it on our page, and essentially build out our HTML on the fly using our AJAX call to our PHP backend, which is going to query into the database and return back the necessary needed content. So once you're set up and ready to go, in order to work alongside with the source code, you can also upload the PHP files. If you have a PHP server, you can upload them to there, and if you have a database, hopefully you've got phpMyAdmin installed as well, or that you're familiar with interacting with the database, because as I said, there's not a lot of interaction with the database. It's going to be a simple connection, and we're going to run a few queries that are going to populate some data within the database. So that's going to be the extent of what we're doing within this course in regards to the database. So if you are already familiar with databases and adding entries into the database, you can use whatever format you're more familiar with. So when you're ready, let's start building out this course that's coming up in the next lesson. Welcome back, and now we're going to get into the coding of our application. So the first thing that we want to do is open up our editor, and I'm going to actually hide that sidebar, and we're going to start coding we're going to create a new file, and this file is going to be an index page. So this can actually be a regular HTML page because it is going to be using AJAX in order to make that connection. So let's go ahead and save this one. We're saving it within our directory, and I'm going to just call it index.html, or you can call it index.php. It doesn't really matter. It's just our starting point for our application. So now let's build out the basic HTML structure. So HTML opening, we've got our head, and let's add in a title. So we'll call it Scroll Project. And next, let's do body, and opening and closing of body. And usually I like to have some divs in here, so I'm going to give the first div here an ID of container, or maybe better yet, a class of container. And so this is where our div is, and then within here, let's output some content here. So again, we're going to give it a class, or give it an ID of content, because we want to be able to really easily access it via our jQuery and deposit some information in here. So we're just going to leave it blank for now. The other thing that we do need as well is we need that jQuery library because we are going to be using jQuery. So we're just going to use the CDN available at Google hosted libraries, and thank you to Google for hosting these libraries and giving us really easy access to bring jQuery into our projects. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to write the script files, and I'm actually going to keep it on page. Obviously, you have the option if you're reusing the code across multiple pages, it's always better to link it out to a source, much like what jQuery has done here, where we just link it to a just.js file. But we do want to keep all of this here on the same page. So because this is just a simple one-page project, I am going to be writing that content within this one page. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to actually load, we want to create a function that's going to load whenever the page loads. So this is going to be essentially initiating our jQuery content. So we're going to open and close, and then close that one off there. So in here is where we're going to create the bulk of our content. We also need to set up some variables, and I am going to work through those later on as well. So initially what we want to happen is we want to be able to load some content into our content area, because as of right now, if I go to this web page, not a whole lot happening. We don't see any content being loaded, and this is what essentially we want to do within this project. So we want to make an AJAX connection to a PHP file, a server file, which is going to connect to the database and be able to output our content that we need. So the next lesson, we're going to actually build out some content, some random content in the database, and that's coming up. Welcome back, and in this lesson, what I want to do is I actually want to populate the database with some content. So this is going to require some PHP. So I'm opening up a brand new page, and I'm going to initiate my PHP functions. So what I wanted to do first is I wanted to connect to the database. And I'm actually going to do this all within this one file. I'm going to create a file that allows me to create my database connection, and I'm going to have some default defined variables in here. So I'm going to define the first one as db and underscore host. And if it's not defined, then we're going to go ahead and define it. So when the page loads, if db host doesn't have a definition, then I'm going to go ahead and define it, and I'm going to define it as where my database host is. So this doing it this way is going to make it a lot more flexible if I do need to change any of these parameters, if I'm uploading it to another web server, another web page, and so on. So let's first let's create con.php. So this is a PHP file now. And I need to define some more parameters here for our database. So we have a database host. We also have a database user. So we need to be able to define that user. And if you are using the XAMPP server that I am using, then this is just simply root. If you're not using that, then you need to make sure that you know what user you have set up in order to connect to the database. Another thing that we need for the database is we need a password, and for XAMPP, the password is going to be simply blank. And again, if you're using the same one, then you can go ahead and make that connection. And then we need to establish a database. So we need a name for our database, and our database name can actually be, we'll just call it SP for scroll project. And then lastly, this is where I'm going to establish the link to the database. So I'm going to run MySQL I connection. So that's MySQL I is MySQL improved. And I'm going to connect using the database host. Next, I need to get the database user. Then after that, I need to get the database password. And then the database name that I want to connect to. So there we go. So now that we've set all of this information up, let's check to see if link is valid. So if link is not there, then let's kill this process because something actually went wrong. So we've got an error somewhere within the system, and we can actually output that error within PHP, where we can use MySQL I connect and error. So that's the value for where we're able to pull back that information from the connection to be able to determine what that error is. I'll close that one off and comment it out. So basically, if we have no connection, then we're going to do a connection error there. So now let's pop over to the PHP MyAdmin, and we're going to create a brand new database. So going into the root of it, let's go ahead and create a database. So we've got ability to create databases here, and we're going to create a database. So that database that we had specified there, we've got our database created. So we do need a number of values here within the database in order to present it, and so we need to have a number of tables there. So we've got an API and we've got the blog posts. So essentially the API is going to connect a bunch of information here, and we're going to make use of that. And then we're also going to have our blog posts, which essentially are going to be the content that we're creating. So let's go back over to here, and we're going to create blog posts, or we could just call it B posts to be short. And number of columns that we need, we only essentially need 2 columns. We've got content and date, so we need to have ID as well. So we're going to create those 3 columns now. So it's ID, and I'm going to make this smaller so I can see. So we've got the AI primary ID. The next one that we want to create is content. So content is can be anything. We'll just keep it as text. And then we've got date. So date can be an integer value, and we'll give it a length value of 11. So now let's save that. So now we've got our database with our blog posts ready to go, and we can check to see if we've got our connection. So now we can go over to con.php and check to see if we've got our connection, and we've got an error there on line 6. So let's take a closer look and see what happened. And we see that what's happened here is there's an extra quote there that's been added in. And also I'm going to add in the other curly brackets there. Semicolon. So let's try this out and see if we get any errors. When we refresh the page, no errors. So we've been able to establish our database connection. So next lesson, let's populate some content into this database. So that's coming up. Welcome back. In the previous lesson, we established our database connection, and now let's go ahead and create a new file. So I'm going to call this file build.php. I'm going to use include to include the source file for the database connection. So this will give me the ability to make that connection, and of course this is PHP code, so we need to wrap it with the PHP headers there. So now we're just going to include it. Let's just make sure first that it's working okay. So we reload build, and build is working properly. So one of the sources that I wanted to use is I want to use a lorem ipsum generator. So there's a number of them out there online. One that I want to use is loremsum.net, because they have a really pretty cool API, which is really easy to use, and you can get some placeholder text really easily with it. So you see here within this example that I get some placeholder text, and the idea for lorem ipsum placeholder text is that we want to be able to load some text dynamically in order to populate our database, and that's why we're using this lorem ipsum text. So obviously if you were actually using this project, you wouldn't be loading some random text in there, placeholder text. You'd actually have entries within your database. But because we need to create some content to populate, this is where we're going to create that content using our connection to lorem ipsum. And So we've got some options as well, so we can limit the number of items that get returned, and we can also keep it short as well. So there's a few options here, and it's just all within the URL. So this is the URL that we're going to make our connection, and we're going to use file equals, we're going to use the method file get contents. And so here we need to specify that URL that we just were looking at, and we're going to just go true. And just to show you that we are picking up that information, because sometimes with these APIs it does get tricky, so we always do a quick check to make sure that we are pulling that information out. So we're able to do that query and pull that information out. So now it's a matter of actually taking that content and importing it into our database. So a number of different ways to do that, and probably one of the easiest ways is just to loop through and keep adding these as entries. And this will give us flexibility to loop it as many times as we want. So we're going to create a loop starting with x as 0, and then looping while x is less than 50. So this will populate our database with 50 entries, increment x by 1 as we iterate through all of that content. And so essentially what we're going to do is loop through 50 times. The next thing that we need to do is to create our timestamp. So this is something that we want to add into the database. So this is the Unix timestamp. So I'll just do utime equals, and getting back that current time. So this will give us some more information that we can enter into our database, and I'm going to indent this. So next, let's build out our query. So our query is going to essentially do an insert. So it's going to be insert into, and we need to make a selection of the table that we're inserting it into. So I believe that was blog posts. So let's just I'm going to use the backticks here and just do a quick check just to pop over to our database just to make sure that we are in the correct. So it's actually bposts. So it's a good thing I checked there. So insert into bposts, and we're going to insert into bposts and the values that we're going to insert. So we're going to comma separate out those. So essentially this is the query that we want to make, and we see that with phpMyAdmin you can really easily enter content into here. So let's say this was the timestamp, so I believe it's 11 characters there, so one more there. So this is how we can insert it in, and we can literally just copy this type of format into our PHP. So sometimes I do cheat a little bit with using phpMyAdmin, which gives us the ability to really easily build out these queries that we can utilize later on. We don't need to insert ID, so ID will default to the next available because we did set it up to auto increment. The content that we're picking up is going to be whatever content is available in file, and the time we're going to be inserting is whatever is available within the Unix timestamp. So now it's just a matter of executing the query. So maybe we want to take a quick look and just see that we're able to see content of the query. And I'm just going to bring this number down to 5 just for testing purposes while we're building this out. And we see that we are able to insert it in. So essentially this is going to be the query. So let's try that out here. And notice that we do have some spacing there from the output. And it's actually not coding around it, so that's a problem there as well. So now when I do that, we see that we did do the insert properly. So there were a few issues there that we have to make sure that the contents are getting quoted around. So this is something that sometimes you do need to take care of the quoting here. So I'm just simply wrapping it with a double quote to break out of our query string, and then inserting the single quotes so that we can do that insert. And with the timestamp, we don't need to specify that because this is a numeric value, so we don't need to quote around it. So now let's go take another look at this. See what our output is. So refresh it, and hopefully this should work a little bit better. And we'll try that again now. So just to take a quick look at this and see why it's outputting within this type of format. I've got that really zoomed in there. So we see that we've got a number of paragraphs and it's holding all of that structure. So we might need to do something with that as well. Let's go ahead and add some additional functionality here in order to, so we can use the methods to strip some slashes, or what we can do is we'll first try out and see if it actually inserts in there and if there's some problems with that, because again, we're just trying to get some data in there. So if there are some issues with that, we can take care of that as well at a later point within this lesson. So the next thing to do is just to actually do the query. So we're going to do result and MySQL and we're going to simply execute a query. So it's MySQL and query, so underscore query. This is the one that we're looking for. And we need to link it to the database, so the database connection, and then we need to execute out what query we want to execute out. So MySQL query, and this should deposit that information into the database. To the browser, let's refresh the page. So we're actually still outputting those queries, so maybe we can get rid of that line because we're not going to need it anymore. Go back out, refresh that line, and see that we didn't throw any errors, so that's a good sign. Going over to the database, we can refresh and we can see that we are actually inserting all of that content properly into the database. So now we've got some lorem ipsum text that we can take a look at within our content. So there is HTML there where we've got some formatting and some spacing. So this is something that typically might not be there, it might not want in there, but again, we're just trying to populate the database. So we can run this multiple times, or we can change this variable to something like 50 so that we can really populate that database so that we know that it's working. Let's go back, browse the database, do a refresh on it. So we're up to 24, we're up to 38 entries, and it's still loading them all in, because it's going to run 50 times. So it's 50 queries over to the API, and 62 right now, and 67. So this gives us a good population of data that we can output within our web page. And I think actually I believe what's happening here is a lot of this lorem ipsum looks the same. So unfortunately it does look the same, so maybe it does return that same value all the time, which it does look like it is doing, so there's slight variations. So there might be something different within the returned values, but for the most part it looks very similar, so that's unfortunate. But it did populate our database, so now we've got a total of 67 rows of content in the database, and we're ready to start building out that scroll. So this lesson just simply showed you how you can populate the database. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're ready to start building out our API file. So again, this is going to be PHP, and this is going to be the connection point for our PHP application to send back data from the database. So we're going to connect to the database, send some data back to our JavaScript front end, and basically provide the next item of content for the front end. So let's go ahead and save this build as API. So this is going to be our API endpoint. And I need to keep the connection there, and I don't need the rest of that stuff there. And so with this API connection, what we want to do is we want to make our selection from our database. So let's go ahead and build out those variables. So the first thing that we want to do is do our connection, and we want to select all from the database. So that was going back to see what my database was called, and so it was BP posts. So select all from BP posts, and we need to order it by the ID, by the ID value, and we're going to also limit it. So select from the database, order by ASC, so we're going to limit it to 1, and we're also going to have an offset value. So offset value. So this is going to be the starting point of where we're picking up from, and we're going to update those dynamically. So essentially we're going to start out at value number 2 within this query. Next, let's do our actual query. So result. And this is MySQL I query, and we're going to specify that we're grabbing that query. And now we need to loop through the contents of the query, and we need to actually build it out into a retrievable format, so ideally a JSON format. So let's create an array. So we'll start out with just a blank array. So this is our placeholder array, and so we're going to query into the database offset of 2. So let's first of all, let's try out our query here just to make sure that everything is working, and we see that we are returning an item there. So we're starting out, we're limiting to return 1 item, and we're offsetting at 2. So that basically is starting out at so we're offsetting 1, 2, so we're starting at the third one there, and that's where we get that third item returned. So we're not actually selecting anything where, we're actually just going through and selecting the different items. So the concept is that we're going to update the limit and we're going to update the offset, and that information is going to come from the front end, from the index page when we're doing our AJAX query, and then we're going to return back those results. We also want to build out the ability to have the flexibility to retrieve back more than just the one result. So this is where we're going to create a loop. We're going to loop through the contents that are available within the result here, within the database result. And we're going to load them into a variable called row. So we've got result here, and we're going to be fetching the array. And so what this is going to do is this is going to loop through all the available items here and add them into, I'm going to create another array here. So this one we'll call my row. So this is another holder for some data. So as we loop through, the value of my row is going to add in an array value, and this is where we're going to use those arrays to output within a JSON format. And we're going to have a bunch of objects here within the array. So the first one, we'll give it an ID, and this is going to correspond to the output that we're picking up in row. And so we're going to be returning back row ID. Next item that we want to have is content. So we're going to be outputting row content. And then lastly, let's output the date as well so that we can use it within our front end code, within our HTML. So date and row date as well. So into a variable, we don't need that last one. So what's going to happen now is that what's going to loop through, it's going to build up this array of content, and we're going to use this my array to hold the content of all of that information that we built up. And the reason that I'm doing it this way is that this is going to provide more flexibility on our returned values that when we build out our JSON format. And now, at the end of the day, all we have to do is we have to echo out JSON encode, and that should be an underscore, so JSON encode, and whatever is contained within the my array. So let's go out to the API and just check to see if everything is working. See that when we go to the API page, we're getting this content output when we look at the source. So this is formatted JSON ready to be retrieved using AJAX to our front end API, and all we have to do is provide some more additional updates here to take in the parameters from our API AJAX call. So all of this and how to do that is coming up in the next set of lessons. Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to do an overview of what we've done and what we've gone over in the previous lessons. So initially we started out by creating our index page. We linked it to AJAX, to the jQuery library, so that we can use jQuery AJAX in order to make connections to our backend database. So we're going to create an API where we can query and return back information that's contained within our database. And the next step was to populate our database. So for that we had to create a file in order to create connection to the database. So we've got all of our database information here, establishing the connection to the database, and then we built out a PHP file that populates content into the database. So that way we would have some content that would be sitting within the database that we could utilize. So we created a table called bposts, and all of this content here has just been generated using a connection to lorem ipsum. And so they have an API where you're able to return back some data and populate that in. So that's what this function here was doing, where we're looping through, we're making connections, pulling out, retrieving some content, and then posting that into the database. And our last step was that we worked on is to create another file, and this is going to be our API endpoint, and this is where we actually connect to our database. So depending on what the query is, we still need to make some adjustments to this, and the idea here is that we're going to take in information from our index.html page, and that is where we're going to know when how many items we're returning, so that's the limit there, and then where we're starting off to do those returns of the various posts that we have available in our database. And this is where we're going to use that offset number of 2. So I've just got some placeholder numbers in there for now, just to make sure that our JSON is working properly. So we created 2 holder arrays. We ran the query here and got the result. We fetched it as an array, and we looped through all of the items in the array, setting them as a variable called row. And with row, we were able to access the information contained within the database. So we had our ID, content, and date there. And we were depositing all of these into our myRow container array. So this array would essentially be holding all of the different items as an array object. And then down here is where we use myArray, and we use the object value of content, so that when we encode it in JSON, essentially we're returning back a really nicely formatted format for JSON. So this is what we're returning back right now. The PHP file gets accessed, and this is content actually coming from the database starting at ID number 2, because we've offset it by 2. So that's where we are right now, and the next step is to start making those connections between the index page and connecting it via AJAX and over to the API.php file. So that's what's coming up in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to load our AJAX call. So we're going to load that, we're going to create that into a function, and the function is going to be called load art. and we're going to pass some values, a variable in there, so passing in an argument that's going to be contained within A. So right now that's just going to be a placeholder, and I want to set up that AJAX call because I do want to test it out, and I want to be able to make sure that I'm able to retrieve data back from our API. So this is a jQuery AJAX call, and jQuery makes it really super easy to make these AJAX calls. So we just need to enter in our parameters. So one of them is we need to enter in the URL where that API endpoint is located. So that's that API.php file that we had created earlier that actually outputs to JSON data. So next we need to specify the type of call it's going to be, and we're going to make it a post. And then afterwards, we can also specify that our data type is going to be JSON, so that this way our AJAX call actually knows what type of data it's expecting back, and it'll automatically format it in a JSON format. And then next, let's do success. So if we have a successful, or if we retrieve a successful callback, then we're going to pull all that information that's being sent back, we're going to deposit it into an argument called data, and then we can work with that argument. So let's console log out data, and we'll take a closer look and see what that looks like. So for now, when the page loads, we're going to load this function. We don't have an argument that we're going to be passing. So right now at this point, we're just going to put a value of 4 in there. So let's go back to our index page and run, and we're going to take a look into the console and see what output we're producing. We've saved it and go back out here, and we see that we are retrieving information, and you see the way that it's formatted. So we've got content and we've got our object, and then within here we've got the content that's being returned back, because we're only returning back one item here. So I'm going to quickly go over to the array, and I'm going to adjust it to return back 4 items here. So we'll show you how that's going to look, and we see once we've made a request for 4 items, we've got 4 different items here within this object array that are being returned. So we've got our object, main holder object, and it has a value of content. So this key value for this item in the object is going to be content, and then the values are going to be an array, and we've got 4 items in here within the array, and then each one of these array items is an object as well. So we've got object, array, object formatting here, and this is also how we have to retrieve that data. And then within each one of these array items, we've got the values for content, date, and ID, and this is all information that's being pulled directly from the database. And we can see how we can specify how many items we return back by adjusting that limit. So this is a value that we can potentially send within our AJAX call, and then pick that up within our PHP. So let's add that part in as well. And going back into the index, we see that we can add in the ability to send data. So I'm going to add that in here because we are using post. And data within the AJAX call, this is going to be an object formatted for data. And there's 2 values that we're going to be passing through. So I'm going to set these up as variables. So the first one is going to be offset. And we're going to start offset at 0. And the next one is going to be the number of items we're going to load. So I load. And we're going to set that to be 1. And then within the AJAX call, we're going to pass that data over. So we'll just call it oset as well. And this value is going to be equal to the value of oset that we've set up here. So that's going to be the first parameter that we're passing over. And the next one that we're passing over could be called iLoad, and it's picking up the variable iLoad. So whatever these values are, we're going to make our adjustments, and we're going to query over every time we do the loading there. And eventually what we're going to do is we're going to update that argument in order to take those parameters in. So maybe we can do that as well now, where we've got the number that's going to get loaded. So iLoad equals whatever the value of A is, or we can even simplify it by simply loading the value of A. So we see that we're passing that value of 4. And now we need to be able to retrieve that data that's being sent with our AJAX call. Let's pop over to the API. And here we need to, because we're posting the data, we need to be able to pick that information up. So let's do a quick check here to see if there is a value for the post. So we're going to check to see if it's empty. And if it is empty, then we're going to set one value, and if it's not empty, we're going to set another value. And the variable that's coming in, so this is a request variable, so it's under post. And I believe we called it iLoad. So that's what we're going to be picking up. So if there's a value for iLoad, if iLoad is empty, then we're going to simply set a variable. So maybe we can call this as the v limit, and we'll set that to be 1. But if it's not empty, then we're going to set the value of v limit to be equivalent to whatever the value is that's coming in within that post. So now let's make our update within our query. Another thing too that I also wanted to add in within this lesson, so the limit is not going to be 4 anymore, so it's going to be dynamic depending on what the value is that's coming in here. So another thing too that I want to add in, and this is one of the reasons why I kept out the myArray, because this gives us the ability to return various objects. And one of the objects that I did want to track is maybe that vLimit, just to make sure that everything is passing properly. And that's one of the challenges when you're building out these APIs. You want to really make sure that you're passing these values properly. So now we've got a value of 4 that we're passing in for vLimit, and we're able to pull back 4 entries. So let's see what happens when we do a request for 7 items and refresh the page, and we see that vLimit is 7 and content is returning 7 items. So that's working great, and next lesson we're going to look at how we can add in that offset value and make that dynamic as well within our API code. So that's coming up in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be building out our API query. So we saw that earlier, we're passing some data, we're passing a value for offset, we're passing a value for iLoad. That iLoad value is an argument, a parameter that gets passed within the function. So when we load the function, we can specify how many items we want to return, and we can do that within the parameters of the function, passing it over and then making it within the AJAX call, and that goes over to the API where we pick up that iLoad value, and that's what we go off of here. So the next item that we want to update is the offset. So this one is probably going to be a little bit more complex, and for this one we've got to apply some logic. So we see that when we're building out, when we've got a successful function, we get a bunch of data returned. So let's loop through all of that data. So we're going to create a for loop to loop through that data. And we know that we can start out with a variable I, we're given a value of 0, and we want to loop out while the value of data, content, length, because this is going into an object array, so we have a length for that, and we're going to increment I so we're able to complete our loop. So what we want to do now is we want to increment offset. So offset is starting out at 0, so we want to, every time we pick up a new item, we want to increment the offset. So the other thing too as well, I want to shorten all of this that we're doing here, and I want to create a variable called item, and this item variable is going to hold data, content, and it's going to hold the value that's being returned back for I. So essentially it's going to get that array item and return that back, and that of course is an object because we've got an object, an array inside of an object, and then we've got more objects inside of that array. So next I want to build out the HTML. So I'm going to set up another variable for that, and every time we iterate through the loop, we're going to continue to build this out. I'm going to set a class for these. I'm going to just call it blocks, so we just can distinguish that content. And now let's add in the content. So the content is added in by item, because remember, we're containing the object information here within item, and we can be specific. We can just return back the item ID. Maybe leave a space there and another space, and then this is where we can add in that item content. I'll probably do a little bit more styling later on as well. And then next, let's add in that date. So that is item and date. And as we loop through, then lastly, we need to close off that div and close off that HTML. So next, what we can do is we can append that HTML to the content element. So with an element with the ID of content. So let's do that now as well. We could also build out that HTML, and every time we loop it, we could only do that one appending to it. So again, it depends on how you want to structure your code. But for this instance, just so it visually makes a lot more sense, I'm going to do it within this type of format. So selecting out the element content, I'm going to append the HTML. So adding in that HTML value that we've been building out, and every time that HTML value gets filled, we just simply append it to content. And also offset is going to continue to increase. So let's go take a look at this now, and let's refresh it. That we're getting all of this content output. We're starting with ID of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we're getting 7 items back, and these are all the items we have sitting in the array. One other thing I did want to do is take care of the styling in this lesson. So we saw that we added a class called box. So let's do some styling for each one of these elements that we're getting, or each one of these data sets that we're getting back, and apply solid black border. Maybe we can also apply some padding to it as well. So padding, maybe 10 pixels of padding. And we can also apply even more styling as needed. So basically, and I don't know why I wrote block there, but I needed a color, so that's why that wasn't showing up. So now I can really distinguish each one of these pieces of content. I've got a date there, I've got the content, and I've got the ID at the top. So now next is to link in that offset into the API and start returning back the values associated with that offset. So much like what we did with the iLoad, so when we're specifying how many items we want to load, we're going to do the same thing for offset. And now as offset has incremented, we can see that the value of offset should now be 7. So it started out at 0. So that looks like it's working properly, and then the next time we query in, we should start at item number 7 within this object. So let's go take a look at that and build that out for the upcoming lesson. Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to continue to build out that offset value. So first thing I wanted to do is actually attach that offset value in the API. So much like what we did over here, we can do relatively that same format where we're picking up that offset value. So that's being sent within the AJAX as offset. So there's the item there that's being posted. So we can pick that up, and much like we did with iLoad, we can offset, or we can set the value within offset. And maybe let's just use OSET here just to be consistent with our naming. So now we see that we've got our offset value, and we can also pass that offset value into our returned JSON. So we'll pass in offset there. And next, much like what we did over here, let's do the same thing for offset, where we're going to specify this offset value, and the variable we used is offset. So let's go out to our page, refresh it, and we should start at 0. So something hasn't gone right. Let's go take a look. We can't actually probably see it within the API. or actually offset should be 1 within that API. So let's go over to API PHP, and we can see that we've got a syntax error. So this is something that wasn't being returned obviously within the jQuery, because we're expecting an identifier. So something happened there within that line of code, line 23. So let's go take a closer look at that. And it looks like we probably had an issue here with the query. That's because I added in that extra quote there. So now let's go take a look at that. And that one is returning properly. So when we refresh the page, we see that we're offsetting starting at 1 and we're loading this content. So now let's go over to here, because this actually isn't correct, because we should be starting with the offset value of 1, and it doesn't look like we're starting with offset 1. So we need to make some adjustments to that offset value. So let's go back over to here, and basically we need to start offset at 0. And the value of offset, let's just make sure that we are passing a value of 0. So the value of offset, I'm going to console log that out. So this is a little bit of troubleshooting, and sometimes you got to do this in order to make sure that you're passing those correct values into your JavaScript. And now it looks like it is working properly. So we're starting out with a value of 0. We're sending that offset value of 0. And let's go take a look, and it is returning back that first entry there. So going all the way down to 7, starting with the first entry. So one of the things here, we just need to make sure that our API is connecting properly, and we're actually passing this posted value of offset. And maybe what I'm going to do is I'll make an adjustment to the default here. I'm going to set the default as 5 just to make sure that the 0 is actually passing properly. So what is actually happening is we are trying to pass 0, but it's actually not picking it up properly. So there is an issue that we're not picking up this value within the post properly. So let's go take a closer look at our data here that we're passing in. And we know that when offset is here, it's got a value of whatever the main value is. So we know that at this point offset is 0, and for some reason it doesn't look like it's passing it properly. So let's build out an object here, and we'll just call it holder. And within this holder, this is where we're going to store this data information as an object, and then we're going to simply pass holder here. And so instead of outputting offset, let's just make sure that we're passing those correct values into our data here. So again, some troubleshooting just to see what's happening. And we see offset is 7, iLoad is, or offset is 0, iLoad is 7. So initially we're passing those values properly, but for some reason the API is not picking up the post of offset, and it's not proper. It's simply going back to the default because there's no value that's being passed within offset. So let's do one more piece of troubleshooting and do my array error, or we could just call it whatever was passed there, and this is going to equal to whatever that posted value is of offset. And now let's go back and refresh it. So we see that that error, the posted value of offset is 0, but for some reason we've got that value of 5 coming in there. So basically what's happening is that if it's empty, it's getting this value, and this should actually not be if it's empty. We should be looking to see if. Let's do one other test here, and we're going to check to see if we're passing over and what our Boolean is. So we're going to see if the post offset is actually empty, and if it is, then we're going to see that we've got an error. So in fact we are getting true, so this is coming out empty, so it's actually not passing, it's not posting that value of offset. Basically, what the problem is that's happening here is because we're looking to see if the post value is empty. And because when we go over to here, oset is a value of 0, that basically means that it's empty. If I change it to 1 and if I refresh it, then we're actually outputting starting at entry number 1. So this is where the problem is contained, because we're not actually passing a value for empty. And we need to find a better way to check to see if there's any content contained within this post. Basically, that empty worked for here, but it doesn't necessarily work for this. So let's go back over and change oset to 0, because we still want to be starting out at an offset of 0. And instead of empty, we're going to check to see if it is set. And basically, this will check to see if a value is set. And if this is true, then we're going to add in that value that's been passed. Otherwise, we're going to set an offset of 0. And let's try this out now. So when I refresh it, we load that content as needed. And when I type in the value of offset, I know that it's 7. So next time I load, I should be starting at the next entry. So next lesson, so this lesson was a bit of debugging as well, and the next lesson we're going to move ahead with some more AJAX and jQuery functionality in order to create this dynamic loading of content when we scroll. So it's coming up in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson we're going to do some jQuery and opening up that index file. So what I wanted to do is add in a loader here, so whenever our window scrolls, we want to fire off that function to load additional values. So this is going to be using the Windows object, or the window object, and whenever scroll is initiated, it's going to fire off this function. So the function has no arguments, and it's going to be self-contained. So basically, if we're going to do a check to see if the user is near the bottom of the page. So we're going to check if it's window and scroll top. The value of this method is going to be greater than or equal to the value of the document. And these are all values contained within the DOM. So within the document object as well as the Windows object. So take a look at those as well within this lesson. So that we've got the document height, and then we also have the window object height as well. So we're going to take a look at those, and we're going to subtract the one from the other. So if they're the same, then they should equal 0, and then we're subtracting 100 off of that. And basically, if the user is near the bottom within that 100 area of the bottom, that's when we actually want to load our content. And for this one, we're going to just initiate, and we're going to load one item into there. And the rest of that information, the offset, should continue with whatever it left off over here. So let's so basically we're loading that function, and we're providing the scroll functionality. So let's refresh the page, and we can see that we are continuing. So we've got 6, 7, 8, we've got 8, and it looks like we're stuck on 8. So even though we're able to continuously load, we're loading a number of the same values, some number of the same items here, and we're not really having a lot of control over what the next value is that we need to load in. So there's really not a lot of content control here, but we do see that once we hit the limit, we're not loading any more items here because we don't have anything else to load within, so there's been nothing sent back. So it relatively kind of worked, and we do need to do some more debugging in order to get it working a whole lot smoother. Let's do some debugging on that in the upcoming lesson. Welcome back, and in this lesson I want to do some even more troubleshooting for our project. So it looks like what's happening is that the query isn't exactly loading the next offset value. So what we're going to do now is we're just placing it in the myArray, and we're actually calling back that entire query so we can actually take a look at it and see what's being loaded. So when the first page loads, we're actually loading 7 items, and that's being passed starting an offset of 0, and our query is this, where we've got select all from bpost, order by ID, ascending, limit 7, offset 0. So now we can go in here and we can try that SQL query. So what is being returned here should actually match up with what we see in our output. Now the problem happens when we actually start scrolling and loading more content in the page. So first of all, we see that initially it looks proper where we've got our query and we're looking at the next available item. So again, I'm going to just use that SQL query here, and we see that this is the next available item that should be showing up. But what's actually happening is that we've got 8, 9, and then we're doubling up on 10, 10, 11, we're missing 12. So it's not really consistent with the way that it's outputting this content. And we see that as well because we're returning back this object here in 33, and the problem is that this line 33 seems to be running multiple times, and we're only getting back these queries. So we're running the query, and then it's returning back and it's returning back. So we're already running the next scroll. So we're actually it's a problem with the AJAX calls because we're actually not allowing it to complete the load, and this is where the problem is, that we're continuously making AJAX calls and we're not giving that data enough time to return. So what we need to do is have another function in the middle here where we're going to call hold load or something like that, and we're set it to false. So this will just be a Boolean value, and once we've made our AJAX call, then what we're going to do is we're going to set this to true, and we're not going to allow any more AJAX calls until we've completed the call and we've completed this entire loop. So now over here we'll hold load, we'll set that one back to false, and basically we're going to do a check here to see if hold load is not true, then we can do the loading, and if it is true, then we're not going to load that AJAX. So let's go back into the calls and we'll see if this loads a little bit better. So see, we've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and all the way down. So we can continuously scroll, and we see that we're no longer missing any numbers there. So that was a quick patch up of loading that content, and what's happening now is that we see that we've come to the end and we're no longer needing to load any additional content. So that's it for loading and having our infinite scroll. And of course, once we add in some new content here, so we can do another build here, which will build and add in some additional rows of content. And now when we go back into the database, we're going to have actually more than that 67. So when I refresh it here, we'll see that we can once again add all those new items. We can have that infinite scroll. So initially when the page loads, it doesn't load all the items, but it's only when you start doing the scrolling that's going to load all those additional items and allow us to scroll all the way down to the bottom. And once we hit the end of the entries in the database, then it's going to stop the scroll and not allow us to actually scroll anymore, because right now we're at that offset 117. So even though we're doing that query selection, we're not going to return any values, and that's basically what's happening here. So when I go to SQL there and I go, we don't have any values that are being returned. So this is something as well that we can look at, and we can see that if this array is at 0, then what we can do is we can basically set that hold to be true, and that will stop that whole loading process. So basically, if there's no length within that content array, so put a condition there. If content array length equals 0, then what we're going to do to hold load is we're going to set it back to true, and that should stop from any additional queries. So again, another quick bug fix. Let's scroll it down all the way to the bottom. And we can see once we hit that end item there in our array, we're not returning any more items within our array. That's when we can stop the scroll entirely. So it's not making any more AJAX calls, and basically we've loaded all the data that's available within the database to load into our infinite scroll project. Welcome back. In this lesson, I'm going to be doing an overview of all of the files and what they're doing and how this project is functioning. So initially, we set out to create an infinite scroll. So what an infinite scroll does is it only loads part of the available data, and as you scroll, then it continues to load more data, and that data is sitting within this database. So we see that we've got 117 entries, and initially, when we look at our initial load, we're going to load 7 of them once the page initiates. We're going to load 7 entries, and effectively that's going to make the user scroll down if they want to see any additional entries. And as they scroll down, that's where we're populating and we're making additional AJAX calls to the database, returning back another set of content. And the way that we're controlling it is we're counting out the offset, and we've also got another value that we're passing within that function in order to limit the number of items that actually are getting returned. So we do have quite a bit of control over that. And as you can see, eventually, once we hit that 117, we stop loading all of the objects altogether. So let's go look into our source code, and we're going to look at, first of all, we'll look at the con.php. So essentially, this is just a typical database connection script where we can bring it in to our PHP code using an include anytime we want to have a database connection. And the database connection is using the link variable. And we saw that within build, we just include con. We saw that within API, we include con. And that gives us the ability to include that database connection and then work with it down here within the scripting. So what we did within build.php, the basic functionality of this was that we needed a way to populate some content into the database. So we used lorem.ipsum.net, and they provide an API to generate some dummy lorem ipsu text, so some placeholder text. So we're just using that, we're making queries to them, returning back the results, and that's what we're actually putting into our database. Another value that we're picking up is the time. So this is something else that we can have some additional unique values that we're placing into our database. So essentially, if you're working on a real project, you won't need to do this step where you build out and populate the database with dummy content, but this is something that we needed for this project, so we populated out some dummy content and used our PHP functionality in order to do that. Now, the next PHP file, so we created 3 PHP files, and the last one was the API. So this is the endpoint connection that we use in order to generate, right at the bottom here, the JSON file, which is essentially a data file that we can interact with and use and parse through within JavaScript. So what we've done here is we've got our connection to the PHP, we've got a couple arrays that we're setting up. So these are ones that we're going to use within the script below. The first one, the my array. So this essentially, this is a holder for data to be returned via the API. So what we're doing is we're adding in any content that we want to actually pass back to the front end code. So my array is used over here where we put an object here, a key value here, and then we've got some content here on the right hand side, so we're equaling at that, and anything that we're putting in here, my array square brackets, is actually getting returned back within the query. And we can see that here, that we've got that content array, we've got the offset, we've even got the query that we added in. And so this was more for troubleshooting, and we also have the v limit. So you can play around with these and make adjustments as needed. So this was just there in case we want to adjust the values that we're returning back to the user. So the next one was the myRow array, and so this is the one that we used in order to populate entries and then eventually build out an object array that we can pass into the myArray object content. This gave us the ability to return back content information. And we see that what if over here we're requesting 7 items of the content, they're all nicely built here within the object array. So this essentially, if we're only returning 1 item, we don't need this, but we want to have the flexibility within our queries in order to return back a number of items from the database. So they're nice and neatly placed here within an array, and they're all objects, so they've got additional details and information that's available from the database. So that was what we were doing here, where we're building that out. So this essentially was the query that we built out. Over here is we're checking to see if the value of iLoad is empty. So if it's a 0 or if it's an empty, we need to set it as 1. So we're going to set the value of 1, and this is the number of items that get returned. So we're loading it in from the front end as iLoad. We're picking it up in the post, and we're setting our variable here within PHP called vLimit. And we're using that vLimit over here to limit the number of items in the query that we're returning back from that query. And the next one here, we're checking to see if post oset is set, and if it is set, then we're using the value of oset as the post. So this is our offset value, and we know that within the front end, as we return items, we're going to increment that, and we're going to effectively pass that back every time to the API, and this gives us our starting point so that we know where we left off and what additional data we need to add in. And that's where offset comes in, and we use just the basic functionality that's available within the MySQL query to set our placeholder of where we left off using offset. So this is where we start again, and this is where we load the additional new data. Over here, we're just placing more content into the return values. Here is where we're actually executing out that query that we've got up here, and we're using the link. So this was coming from con, and this is allowing us to have that database connection. Over here, we've got the result, and then this is a database function where we're fetching the array. So the result, fetching the array, and we're looping through it, placing it into a variable called row, and then row actually gets all of that information that's available in each row of our database. And here we're just building out an array within myRow. So this is actually giving all of these objects here within that content that's being returned. And then lastly, what we're doing is we're taking the values of myRow, we're placing it into content, and all of these arrays and objects were JSON encoding, and basically that's giving us a nice, neat JSON file that we can pick up from the front end and utilize within our code. So that's it for the PHP code of it, and in the next lesson we're going to do a quick overview of the HTML code that we used within the front end. Welcome back, in this lesson we're going to do an overview of our jQuery code. So essentially what we started out with was a basic HTML template. We added a little bit of styling here, and we've got some basic HTML in order to be able to dump out some dynamically generated content from our jQuery into our HTML elements. So we give it an ID of content in order to identify it. Over here, we're linking to the jQuery library because we did want to use jQuery within this project, because jQuery is just a natural way to make AJAX calls. It's so much easier than JavaScript. So this was our choice, our chosen way to make that AJAX call. So we set up some variables here, and we needed to track the offset. So essentially the offset was giving us our last point of our last item that we pulled out from the database, and incrementing that gave us the next item, and we were able to pull out all of the items of the database using that offset. The iLoad was giving us a basic starting point number that we could use in order to load content. So by default it would have been 1, but we also have an option to load as many items from the database as we want within that function, that load art function. So that was essentially our holder for that. And then we found that we also needed another variable, a Boolean, where we can actually shut down those AJAX calls until they've actually completed. So we saw that there was an issue with loading multiple AJAX calls multiple times. Every time we scrolled, it continued to load those, and some of those calls didn't get a chance to finish, which was causing a huge issue that we were doubling up some of the content that we were returning, and it was starting to get messy. So we added this in order to be able to turn off essentially our AJAX calls until we can finish loading the previous ones. So next we had looked at a function. So this was just a jQuery, so whenever the page loads, then we load all the items into the page. So we want to load 7 items as a default. The next function that we have here is the scroll. So this basically listens on the Windows object and returns back if we're scrolling. So in order to see more about the Windows object, you can use console directory and window. And I'm also going to do console directory, and I'm going to output document, because these are two very informative objects that are available within when the page loads. So when your web page gets constructed by the browser, it creates this Windows object which has a whole bunch of information, and also creates the document object. And the document actually sits inside of the window, but we can call to it separately as well. So let's take a quick look at those. So we see that the Windows object, there's just a ton of information there, and some of the functionality that we're using was that scroll. So we can see that scroll is a method here, and basically whenever that scroll gets initiated, that's all we're doing. We're just calling that built-in method within JavaScript. So it's a window scroll, and we get access to it within JavaScript. And also next, so we've got just a ton of information that's here, and this is really quite a bit to go through, and you can access any one of these methods, these objects, anytime using JavaScript. There's quite a lot here. Next, we're looking at the document. So this is more specific for the document object model. So the first one was the Windows object model. You don't hear that much about it, but the DOM you do hear about. And the DOM is where all of this precise data that is pretty much part of your visible area of the content of your HTML page. So we've got all of that information here, and we've also got some of the values that we're pulling out here. So we're pulling out height from here. So we see that we can see what the height of the window is within the DOM as well. So basically it's got a document height value. And it is rather difficult actually to kind of maneuver through here to see all these different values. But that object does exist, and it gives us a height of the available document. And what we're doing is we're just checking to see the height of the document minus the height of the window minus 100. So basically this is giving us a formula that if the value of scroll top from Windows from the window object, which again I don't know if I really want to scroll out to it, but you get the point that there's quite a lot of information here, and we're just using these values that are already present and being built within the objects. So next we looked at, so once we see that there's a scroll, and if it's at a certain location, the scroll, then we initiate our AJAX call, and that's where we're just loading art. So loading art function is where all the magic happens within this application, and we saw that we had to place this on hold. So basically what this is doing is this is allowing that AJAX to finish loading the data before it tries to load anything else. And if it hasn't finished loading, then this value will be true. And if so that's why we've got that exclamation mark there to see if it's actually not true. If it's false, then we continue to load it. But if it is true, then we're going to put a hold on it. So what we do is we set up our variables here. We do a console log here of the content in the holder, and we set hold load to true before we set off to the AJAX call, because what we want is that AJAX call to finish and then set that value back to false, so that we know at that point we can make use of another AJAX call if needed. So next, this is just the AJAX call to our API.php. So we need to specify URL. We can specify a type, so either get or post. This is our data being passed, so that data from up here being passed. Data type is specifying that we're expecting it to be JSON formatted. So this gives us some additional features here on that return data that we know that we're already expecting a JSON format. So next we're looking for success. So basically, if we do get a successful connection and we get some data back, first of all, we're going to log it out into the console, and then we're going to loop through all that data. And this is the looping through of the data. Essentially, that data is under the data content object, and content is an array. So as we loop through the data content arrays, potentially we might have more than one item being returned, and this was again for that flexibility where we can add 7 or whatever number we want of items to be returned within that each function call. So next we're incrementing offset, because this is basically meaning that we've got an item being returned, so we do need to increase offset. So offset was a global variable that we're going to use in order to control where our last point was of data that we had returned the database. Next, we're setting a couple variables here. So I know we could simplify this, where we could just take this into the append, and we could just write out this data content. But this is just a nice, neat format to do it in. So setting a variable of item, which is going to hold the value of data content, which simplifies it when we're adding it here within our HTML. So we just need to do item.id instead of data content bracket ID. So that simplified those values and made it look a lot cleaner. So item date, item ID, and item content gets used there. And of course, if we had even more information from the database, we could simply place them within the string and return them and utilize them within building out our HTML. So essentially, this is just building some HTML. And the next line is jQuery again, appending that HTML to our element with the ID content. So dropping it into content over here, and as we loop through it, it continues to append all of that content. Next, we're going to be completed with this loop, so we're able to take the hold off. So we just set it to false, and that will essentially allow us to run another AJAX call if it does get asked for. And over here, we just set this one additional tweak that basically shuts off the API altogether. If the length of the returned content is 0, then what we're going to do is just shut that off completely, because we know that we've already gone through all the entries within the database. So essentially, that's a quick summary of what we've done within this course, and a quick overview and review of our index.html jQuery functionality.